it's me again. I know it's been a while since I last posted, but that's because I've been busy and sick. So now I'm able to continue with the book, The 1910s. So let's go. Child labor, a national disgrace. Walter Lord. One of the worst features of American society in the first 2 decades of the 20th century was the employment of the nation's young boys and girls in factories and mines. Rather than shielding its youth in their formative years, the nation for too long turned its gaze from the blatant abuses of a system that filled industry with the labor of children. Investigative journalists and politicians placed this issue at the top of their agendas. Some wrote articles exposing child labor, while others sought legislation to correct the situation. Noted historian Walter Lord, who authored a succession of best-selling books on American history, examined the steps taken to eliminate child labor. 1913. Children, the golf links lie so near the mill that almost every day the laboring child can look at and see the men at play. Sarah and Cleghorn, I think. Woodrow Wilson stood for freedom, so it was not surprising early in 1913 when a group of social workers asked him to help free the children from the nation's factories. The new president politely declined. No one was more idealistic, but an important part of his idealism was a deep, almost sacred belief in states' rights. It is plain, he told the reformers, that you have to go much further than most interpretations of the Constitution would allow if you were to give the government general control over child labor throughout the country. So the children worked on, unhampered by federal interference. 12-year-old Owen Jones tore and bruised his hands in the breakers of a West Virginia coma. Tiny Annetta Fettuccini twisted the stems for artificial flowers under the lonely lamp bulb of a New York tenement sweatshop. 11-year-old Sam Bowles, whatever, I don't know how you say that name, did his best in the weaving room of Georgia's White City Manufacturing Company for 40 cents a day. At an Atlanta cotton mill, one nimble-fingered boy stretched 3,000 flour bags a shift. But he had plenty of practice, for he worked a 60-hour week. In Pittsburgh, an unknown little girl rolled 1,000 stogies a day, which meant, looking at it another way, that 1,000 times a day she had to bite off the end of a cigar. This is not my opinion. This is what I'm reading in this book about child labor when that happened in 1910s. So, with the word caution, this is all about child labor. So let me know what you think of it. Somehow, in these years of thrilling reform, there were still areas of extreme poverty. Worst of all, children were lost in the shuffle. Private economists were bored. It was so much more stimulating to rewrite the tariff or draw up the Federal Reserve. Perhaps slavery was to blame. Samuel Gompers was a rugged individualist who had little use for social welfare laws. Perhaps the children were too quiet. In any case, by 1913, some 20% of all the children in America were earning their own living, and the number was growing all the time. In 1900, the census listed 1,750,178 gainfully occupied children aged 10 to 15. In 1910, the figure jumped to 1,990,225. Wow, that's a lot. Those were a lot. To many, this was sad but inevitable. The average family needed $800 a year to get along. Yet most unskilled jobs pay less than $500 a year. Unless general wage levels went up, the children had to fill the gap. As the Clark County, Mississippi Tribune realistically asked, what are the children going to do to keep from starving and going naked? Reform effort. A small band of dedicated people refused to go along with all this. They felt that child labor was one reason why wages are so low. Get the children out of the factories, and the general level was right. These reformers had set up the National Child Labor Committee in 1904, and in the years since then had waged a tireless crusade. They roamed through the factories, they talked to children, they heard out the foremen, they prepared model bills, they badgered state legislators, and occasionally they even pushed through a law. But so many of the victories were hollow. Massachusetts had only 18 inspectors for 56,000 plants. The New York law against tenement work listed some 90 exceptions. In Alabama, a 12-year-old girl might still put in a 60-hour week. The cotton mills posed the biggest problem. Hot competition and little call for skill, the perfect climate for cheap child labor. And the children came. 5,000 little girls between 10 and 12 worked at the spindles in southern plants. In the north, nearly 17,000 male hands were under 16. More meaningful, perhaps, were the figures on injuries. One southern surgeon estimated that he had amputated the fingers of more than 100 children. We don't have many accident mill foremen countered. Once in a while, a finger is smashed or a foot, but that does not amount to anything. No wonder the reform groups were elated in 1913 when two leading cotton textile states, Massachusetts and Georgia, began to consider stronger child labor curbs. Best of all, public interest was growing, and this time it looked as if something might really be done. The Massachusetts bill came up first. It restricted street trades, raised school requirements, and most important of all, set an 8-hour day for anyone under 16. The highest standard yet reached by a cotton mill state. A expected law passed in New England, and in New England, cotton science basked in a glow of self-congratulation. All eyes now turned to Georgia. The bill here was not quite as strong. It gradually raised the working age to 14. But it was a big step forward, and its prospects were bright. Early in August, the Atlanta Journal predicted that the measure would definitely pass, and child labor groups everywhere prepared to elaborate the biggest victory yet. Then on the afternoon of August 5th, word was flashed that the Georgia State Senate had unexpectedly killed the bill. Reaction to reform. What happened? Many Southerners were sure that the Senate had discovered in the nick of time that child labor reform was really sponsored by hypocritical Yankees, hoping to increase Southern labor costs and cut the South's competitive advantage. Northerners were equally convinced that Georgia's failure to act was one more example of Southern backwardness. Blech. Actually, both theories were wrong. No Northerner mill even gave $1 to the National Child Labor Committee, and some of the most active reformers, not only in the South but throughout the nation, were dedicated Southerners. Men like Senator Hoke Smith of Georgia, Dr. A.J. McElway from Atlanta, and Dr. Edgar Gardner Murphy, the Alabama clergyman who organized the whole movement. Moreover, the men who fight against reform in Georgia were not necessarily backward Southerners by any means. Often they were upstanding New Englanders who pointed with pride to enlightening Massachusetts, but applied different standards to the mills they ran down south. There was perhaps no nicer man in Columbus, Georgia, than Frederick B. Gordon, a transplanted Bostonian who ran the Columbus, Massachusetts Manufacturing Company's cotton mill. Active in civic affairs, Mr. Gordon helped fund the primary industrial school, His big new plant and local historian proudly recorded responds liberally to all civic calls, even some that do not directly benefit his own business, and it prospered mightily, quickly repaying northern investors dollar for dollar plus 100% stock dividends. Relaxing in his colonnaded mansion, appropriately called Gornado, I think. Mr. Gordon undoubtedly fitted the description supplied by his authorized biographer. He possesses a genial, sympathetic nature and has found life well worth living, making the most of it every day. Down at the factory, life was a little different. I have never seen so many children in any one mill as there were here, wrote Reverend Harvey P. Vaughn, a gentle Tennessee minister, after a visit in April 1913. The children worked, it turned out, a 12-hour day, from 5:30 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. There was no time off even for lunch. If anything went wrong while they were snatching a bite, they had to stop eating to fix it. When Dr. Vaughn indelicately asked how many of the mill hands were under 14, Mr. Gordon politely declined to answer. As he once explained, the mill owners do not feel that there is any reason for spasm on the part of the paid agitators, the newspaper preachers, or our gentle zealous friends, the club women. Mr. Gordon had always felt that way. It was 1902 when he first tried to set the record straight. Writing to the magazine Social Service, he denied that children were exploited. On the contrary, they were often hired purely as a matter of charity, and they were much better off in the mill than learning the first lessons of a vagrant's life. As for the people stirring up all this trouble, Mr. Gordon felt that at best they were a noble and disinterested class made up of the clergy and the club women, with whom it is quite a drawing room fad. At worst, they were paid and prejudiced agitators, and with perhaps a slight bow toward the Confederates, like he added that these agitators were backed to some extent by New England competitors of Southern mill interests. This was always a good argument in Georgia, and Mr. Gordon wisely did not add that he was a Northerner backed by Northern capital. As for any abuses, he pointed out that the mill owners had a gentleman's agreement that was far more effective than any law, and limited the employment of 10-year-olds to 60 hours a week, and the owners could be trusted to observe legislation based on over sentimentality and disregard of actual conditions. Mr. Gordon concluded sternly, would bruise a severe menace to sudden industrial progress. Opposition mounts. Visiting the Lindale Mills for a few years later, investigator Lewis W. Hines saw youngsters by the dozen, tiny little chaps sweeping, dolphin, spinning. There were 25 of them that I judged to be under 12 in the 3 spinning rooms alone, and I found some more in the weave rooms helping. At that, the Lindale management was more advanced than some, or at least allowed Hines to poke around. Other mills didn't let outsiders in, and since they usually own not only the factories but the houses, stores, and streets as well, their orders were final. When the Reverend Alfred E. Seddon, I think that's how you say his last name, visited Porterdale Mills in 1908, he was refused a room at the local hotel and advised to take the next train out of town. While communities seemed mesmerized in Winona, Mississippi, not Georgia, but typical, a local doctor declared that the longer the children were in the factory, the healthier they grew. One bright little girl, 23, gained 10 pounds in 4 months after going to work in the mill. In 1911, Georgia again considered the child labor question in the reform groups, again found themselves up against ingenious opposition. This time petitions poured into the legislature ostensibly from mill workers all over the state. They begged the lawmakers not to shorten hours, not to stop night work, not to set any age limitations. Some were all signed by the same genuine, painfully scrawled signatures by the few who could write rows of X's for the many who couldn't. Somewhere along the line, the owners also picked up a poet, Laureate. I don't know how you say that word. He was Thomas Dolly, who specialized in obtaining rapturous testimonials from enthusiastic child workers. One little victim of reform in Tennessee was quoted as pleading, "Oh, kind sir, can't you do something to have a law change so that I can go back to the cotton mill?" Against this sort of talent, not much could be done. By the end of the 1911 session, the reform elements did manage to win a 60-hour workweek, but the 11-hour day remained, and it was still legal for a 10-year-old child to work in a Georgia commune. But the reform groups kept chipping away, and in 1912, it seemed as if something might be done. The progressive movement was at flood tide, and best of all, the mill owners appeared to see a lot. Not just liberal manufacturers like Harry L. Williams of Swift Company. He'd always understood. But even Frederick B. Gordon, the transplanted Bostonian, as president of the Georgia Cotton Manufacturers Association, Mr. Gordon indicated that his organization would not oppose a reasonable bill. Just to make sure, the reformers met with the association's officials and went over the provisions together. When the manufacturers objected to parts of the proposed bill, a compromise was worked out. In its final form, the measure gradually raised the age limit to 14. Everybody seemed agreeable. The bill sailed through the House with one minor amendment. Store help was exempted to allow for delivery boys, bootblacks, stock clerks, and the like. Although disappointing, the progressives felt half a loaf was better than none and let the change stand. Not Frederick B. Gordon. He vigorously complained that the bill was no longer in its original shape. Then he appeared at the Senate hearings on behalf of the children who worked in the stores as the reform leaders watched him wide-eyed amazement. They soon learned what was up. Since these lads in the stores weren't covered, Mr. Gordon felt reluctantly compelled to withdraw his support. The Cotton Manufacturers Association fell in line and the bill was defeated. Once again, Georgia had no effective child labor law. When the Reverend Harvey Vaughn resumed his tireless investigations of mill conditions the following April, Mr. Gordon carefully discarded his role in beating the 1912 bill, but he announced he was now definitely going to work for a law. Hence the reformers' optimism when the new bill came up in August 1913. And the surprise when it lost, like so many others. They might have known better, for certainly the pattern was familiar. Again, a compromise approved by everybody. Again, a minor amendment. Again, defeat. Senator Spinks, one of the measure's opponents, tried to placate the progressives. He said that the bill was beautiful in theory, but it would not stand. And he added that Georgia was not ready. Support for reform grows. Maybe not, but almost. Each successive defeat had awakened more interest, and now public support was strong. Georgia labor leaders and newspapers threw their weight behind the battling clergymen and progressive politicians. By December, the sentiment was hot enough for an interesting meeting to take place at the National Child Labor Committee headquarters. Mr. Edward Lovering of the Massachusetts Mills of Lowell and Harry McKellingham of the Franz Lindale Mills, he who had earlier warned so darkly of northern mills, together called on the committee leaders and strongly complained about the drive. They especially resented any comparison of the company's Massachusetts and Georgia mills. They couldn't see why the same age limit should apply to both. The committee couldn't see why not. The movement continued to build up steam, and in the summer of 1914, the Atlanta Georgian went all out in support of reform. All through July, the paper ran immensely effective articles, editorials, and cartoons. By August, the battle was won. A new bill was proposed and this time passed by the legislature. There were loopholes, and the educational requirement was a little weak, but at least children under 14, with few exceptions, were kept out of the mills and factories. Georgia at last had its law. A great day, but poor children were still a long way from rich children. But if America was still a land of extremes, there was at least a great moral awakening. Ordinary people in every walk of life felt a growing sense of social responsibility. It was not so much a political movement as a purely humanitarian revolt against poverty. A warm-hearted crusade for a finer, cleaner life. Child labor reform was only one sign. Another was the spat of laws governing factory safety, minimum hours for women, and workmen's compensation. Reviewing the fervent feeling of the times, the January 24, 1914 issue of Collier's proudly declared, 50 years from now, the future historian will say that the 10 years ending about January 1st, 1914, was a period of the greatest ethical advances made by this nation in any decade. But all too soon, no one even noticed. From the hot, languid summer of 1914. In fact, on the very day the Georgia Senate Committee finally approved the child labor bill, Germany unexpectedly invaded Belgium, and within a few brief years, the tramp of marching feet stamped out such pleasant thought. Please comment, rate, and subscribe down below what you think of the book so far. And if you're on YouTube, please ring that bell notification so they can know when I upload. Because I don't know when I ever have time to. Because I have to go. Because I had to go through my boyfriend's schedule and the schedule of this class I'm going to and whatnot now until like October. And then job interviews. I'm quite busy now. And so I'll post whenever I can, okay? And if you're on TikTok, please like and follow my videos. And on YouTube, let's get to 50 subscribers. And on TikTok, let's get to 50 followers. And once we do that, then I'm going to do something very special, okay? I'm not going to tell you because it's got to be a surprise, okay? And if you can, please pay for something on my eBay and on Mercari, okay? Bye!